I'm Ella.
And I'm Kieron. Welcome to Impolite Company, the podcast in which we bring our Black queer perspectives to some of the most interesting and pertinent DEI issues of the moment.
Join us as we laugh, cry and go deep on what topics are exciting us, as well as what's keeping us up at night. Hi everyone. Today we're talking about grief and specifically the sudden death of Kieron's friend and manager last year, and someone who was actually central to our relationship with one another. The reason actually Kieron and I know one another. A guy called Alex, who was just a solid, great human. I knew Alex because he joined a company that I was working at the time and was one of those great hires that is just super friendly, super supportive of the type of work that I do, really keen to get as involved as possible. And I remember the day that he said to me, "I'm hiring someone that I've worked with before. I think you'll really like him." His name's Kieron. He really gets it. You know, he's a real supporter of this work. And that's essentially the reason that Kieron and I were sort of brought together. It's taken us a year. We've been talking about recording this episode for a year, and it's taken us a year to get there for a number of probably quite obvious reasons. So it's going to be a slightly different episode, and it's going to be focused mostly on Kieron's response to what happened and the loss of Alex, because Kieron and Alex knew each other for a really long time. So a slight deviation from the norm, and probably going to be an emotional one. So just a heads up about that. Let's start, Kieron, with your relationship with Alex. Let's talk about him as a person, how you knew him, the man he was, and sort of your relationship with him over the years.
Yeah, I first met Alex when at a surprise final stage interview for a company that I was interviewing to contract for. So when I met Alex, I was contracting, so I was in between permanent roles, and I decided for a couple of years I was just going to contract and see what the market was like and get an understanding of, you know, where I was in the market, whether I was as good as I thought I was at certain things and as bad as I was at things I thought I was bad at. And it was the second contract, and I'll always remember, because usually when you are a contractor, you don't have to go through the same interview process, but this company in particular put me through 6 stages as a contractor, and it was I think it was initially for a 3-month contract, and I was kind of like going through the process with other places, and they actually offered to me. And the fact that they went through like a whole offer process was also wild for a contractor. But then they offered to me, and I remember being on the phone to the recruiter, and then they went quiet for a couple of days. And then they called me back and was like, "We still want to offer, but the digital director, who was Alex at the time, had just gone through the final stage, and we want you to meet him, and we want him to do the final approval of your role." And I remember at that time being like, I've been through six stages, and I always think about what I would expect from a candidate if I'd done that to them. And I was very close to just pulling out. Obviously, I was so glad that I didn't, because I met Alex, but they arranged the interview very quickly. And I knew immediately as soon as he came up on the screen, because it was during COVID? Yeah, it was during COVID. Was it during COVID? No, it wasn't. But that was done remotely. But I knew straight away, like, he was just a great guy. And his interview, the reason why I knew that was that he wasn't testing me on my skill set, because that had been done already. But I learned this from him kind of further along at that final stage, and something that I still do today. It's more about understanding, you know, what the potential is of that person, whether they're aligned with the culture that you want to create or that you have already. And he was just really good at like asking the questions that I'd never really been asked at that stage. And that's why I knew something was different. I was also massively impressed by the amount of books that he had on his bookshelf behind him. And I think we even had a conversation about
I know which book club you're talking about.
Yeah. Alex loves books. But I just remember feeling so comfortable in his presence immediately.
Yeah.
So that's how we first met. We worked in a property tech company. That was a property tech company. And then COVID hit. And actually before COVID hit, Alex left the business because they were doing some restructuring. So we got about 7 months of working with each other, which was amazing. And we did some really good stuff at that company. And it was based here and it was based in Madrid. And it was just really, really cool. And also in that company in particular, it was the first time I worked with a leader who actually listened and wanted to understand. And then I remember when he was leaving, there was another role that he was kind of in the process for. And he was like, "Are you ready to move country?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he was like, I want you to move to the next company with me." And I was like, wow, okay. I'd never had anyone like that was just like recognized what I didn't even see at the time. And then that's kind of the start of us working with each other. So he didn't actually end up going to that company, but in that time in between, I left the property tech company because COVID completely ruined their business. So they went back down to skeleton. And I worked for another contract. And then he joined the company that we both worked for. And then that's where I worked with him again for the second time and that was for 2.5, nearly 3 years. And then the most recent company, which is the company that I work for now, I wasn't actually meant to join. So I left the business we were working at before Alex did, but Alex then left. I was actually in the final stages of another place and he was like, "I think you should come and see what's going on here." And I was like, I actually wasn't convinced when he first told me about the company because I didn't know anything about the company. I didn't really want to go into the hospitality area. I didn't really think there was an avenue for digital. I knew there was, but not in the same way that it is for like a product and tech company and startups and that kind of stuff in the tech world. And then he was like, "I think you'll really like the people that work here." And I met them once and he was right. And I joined him again for a third company. Yeah. And that's how I met Alex. And and I think over that time, he kind of has been one of the most supportive people I've ever worked with. He's been one of the most, I've learned so much from him from a leadership perspective, but also he just genuinely cared. Our values were very aligned in terms of, the expectations that we have of each other and the people around us and the teams that we lead. So yeah, there was just so many things that we were very aligned on as people. And obviously over that time, we became a very good friend as well.
Yeah. I remember first having my first conversation with Alex and he joined the company that you and I both worked at before I met you. And it was during COVID and we had a Zoom call. And at the time I was a director, but feeling kind of imposter syndrome-y. And he had joined as, I think, a VP. And was super experienced and I definitely was like, oh God, I'm gonna have to meet this new VP. And I was kind of nervous and he was just so, you felt at ease immediately. You felt like he could be in your living room having a chat with you about any topic. Yeah. He had lots to say about everything, but but in a very egoless way. He was one of those, I think, quite rare people who was just interested in stuff and curious 100%. About stuff.
Inquisitive, just like by nature.
Inquisitive by nature, asked really good questions, not for the purpose of asking a good question.
Yeah.
And also a rare leader who, I was doing a new role at that time in DEI. It was new to the company and it was being established. And he was very like, I think this is so important and I want to support it in whatever way I can. And that was borne out, right, in how he mentored people and sponsored people and advocated for people. And this is the kind of stuff we talk about. It feels almost table stakes, but it's not because, I can name on one hand the number of leaders I've experienced who are like that genuinely. And when I decided to leave that company, I remember distinctly the conversation I had walking up and down my street on the phone to Alex because he called me out of the blue and tried to convince me for about an hour not to leave.
Yeah.
And was just so like, okay, in the end, he knew he wasn't going to convince me and let's go for a coffee afterwards and let's stay in touch and all that kind of stuff. So just the best guy.
I think as well, just to add to that, I think I remember a specific situation that to be honest did impact everybody, but I think impacted, and I won't go into the details, but it impacted kind of the leaders of color and minorities in that business. I remember how much it kind of shocked all of us, this situation that happened, not Alex's passing, but in this specific company, decision that had been made. And I remember him just bringing all of his direct reports into a meeting and just saying, tell me how you feel and how I can help. And he just listened.
Yeah.
He didn't try to justify, and it wasn't a decision that he made, it was what someone else had made in the business. He didn't try and justify the decision. He wanted to understand. He genuinely wanted to understand and create a space where we could speak openly. And we all did. And I'll never, ever forget that.
Yeah. You've spoken to me about that before, and it's kind of stuck. So Alex died this time last year, quite suddenly in an accident. Tell me about how it felt to receive the news, because obviously at the time, Alex was your current boss, right? And I know that you received the news in quite a specific setting.
Yeah, I think we were in the unfortunate scenario where we'd only been at the business for 5 or 6 months. I think some people knew that everyone knew that me and Alex had worked together before, but they didn't know for how long and what type of relationship we had. And even there were some people that had worked with Alex before that had joined the business. They didn't know like how long we'd worked for or what type of relationship we had. So the way that I found out, I think in hindsight, it wasn't ideal. I don't think there is an ideal way of finding out these things, but I'd been on holiday for 2 weeks and Alex had passed away the day before I came back to work, but no one had been told. So the way that I found out was we were meant to have a one-to-one on that day. And in the morning, I remember messaging him, obviously not knowing that he'd passed the day before and not getting a response because I think I wanted to change our one-to-one. And then I remember that day I was also doing a talk for another company about design and research. So I did that. I had one of those mornings where you packed way too much stuff in. It's the first day back from holiday. I don't know why I organized to do that morning, but it was for a friend. I came out of that and then I noticed that he hadn't responded, but also a calendar invite had gone into the diary and I was actually in that day. So without going into too much detail, it basically said that it was really important that we attended this call because there was some sad news. My immediate reaction was worst case scenario. So I thought, oh, has he left the business? That was the first thing that I went to. But then I was like, no, Alex kind of would have told me.
Because he hadn't replied to you, right?
Yeah, he hadn't replied to me. And so I messaged him on WhatsApp and I was like, is everything okay? And then someone was like, oh, Alex is not in the invite. So there was this kind of like this panic leading up to this meeting of like what was happening. But I never for a second thought that he would be dead. I thought that maybe he was in an accident. So actually, weirdly, one of the things that I did, which was really weird, was to see if there was any, like, I thought when people said he was flying, we work for a hospitality company, we travel quite a lot. And he traveled quite a lot. I thought, oh, maybe he's just, he was traveling. I didn't realize he was off flying because he used to fly unpowered gliders. So my immediate reaction was like, have there been any plane accidents? But I didn't think, it's really weird because when you're in that, you don't think of the worst. I just thought, oh, maybe something's happened. Like something's happened and he's injured or somebody's in hospital. That was the worst of what I thought could have happened. And I didn't even think it was the plane searching for like plane accidents wasn't me thinking that's what had happened. It was more like, I wonder if there's just been any issues anywhere. It's really very strange. I can't really explain it. So anyway, I genuinely went into this meeting not really knowing what we were going to be told and probably thinking the worst case scenario is that, Alex had decided to leave the business, but then that obviously didn't reconcile with the fact that I know that he would have told me.
Yes.
And then it was one of the most surreal meetings I've ever been in. I kind of knew as soon as the people that were joined, I was like, something's really not good.
Wrong.
Because it was people from C-suite, people from teams people that wouldn't usually be in those meetings. And then we were kind of just we were told, and I think the way that we were told, I think was I don't think there's any instructions to how you deal with this, because as much as I think the person and people delivering this want to be as stoic as possible, we're all human. So everyone was very emotionally impacted by not only sharing that news, everyone had a relationship with him, but also I think by trying to keep a level of professionalism whilst delivering that news, which is like these things aren't really compatible with each other.
Yes.
So as soon as I heard that it was fatal, that's when my brain was like, I think I just went into shock. And I just remember, sorry.
Don't apologize.
I just remember, thanks. I just remember saying, what are you saying?
It occurs to me that even that phrasing, it was fatal, I don't think I would register still what they were saying.
Yeah. It was kind of like when I remember just saying what and having my head in my hands and just not being able to look up, because it was in a group. There was people on video call. We have people that work remotely. There was people in the room. I think I was with like 7 or 8 people. But I remember just being like, not just going into complete survival mode, but just trying to process it. But I just remember having my head in my hands.
Yeah.
I think someone brought some tissues over. I can remember it quite vividly, actually. And just keep saying, what are you saying? Like, I just remember just repeating it, whether it was in my head or out loud. The rest of the meeting, I can't really remember, to be honest. And then there was people that knew him differently that had just started. I had a new starter on that day as well. That was another thing that I was doing that morning. I had someone that joined the business that day, but also there were people that had just met him at the business. There are people that had worked with him and worked with us before. So they weren't in the room actually, but I remember everyone leaving and someone saying, do you want to just stay in here? I think the people saying, well, you can stay in here forever, for as long as you want. And to be honest, I think I was in there for 2 hours. I don't know, an hour. And that was kind of me finding out. And I don't really think I processed it. Well, I definitely didn't process it, but my immediate reaction was I was just in shock. It wasn't what I was expecting, even though I was like, I think some of the searching beforehand, which was like, it wasn't even searching. I searched one thing. It was just like to see if there'd been anything where maybe Alex was injured. Thankfully, I didn't stumble upon an article that actually did come out that day, that morning. I didn't see that, thankfully. I don't know if other people had seen it, but they didn't share that they'd seen it.
When you told me, I Googled it and there was an article up by then on it. I wouldn't have stumbled across it without you telling me, but I did. It was out there within a day or so.
Yeah, I think it was a day or so. So it would have been the day. I think it was published the day that we found out.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the finding out, and I think the immediate thing in that moment was I just wanted to be. It was really weird because I didn't want to go home and be alone.
Yes.
I just wanted to be with other people that knew him. And luckily, there was somebody that worked with us at the time that knew Alex as well, and her partner came and met me at the office, and we just kind of sat and cried.
In a much more minor way, when you told me, I was on like the first day of a holiday, because obviously it's August, so there's a lot of, you just come back from holiday, people going on holiday, and I was in total disbelief, and I felt the immediate need to tell somebody else who knew him. I was with my family.
Yeah.
And they just sort of were like, what? And obviously we're really shocked, but they didn't have any reference point of who this was. And so it wasn't to sort of share the news. It was somehow to have to share
like, not the burden's the wrong word, but it's to emotionally share the processing.
Yeah, share the processing of that news with people for whom that news means something similar.
Yeah.
And I remember that sort of immediate need to do that. And also the sort of, there's something about, so I knew someone when I was a teenager, a boy in my class at high school died in an accident on holiday. And there was a similar weird sort of, I knew him, but I wasn't, I immediately thought, oh God, immediately my thought process went to you, and it went to Alex's family, and it went to the people who I knew had a much more depth of relationship with him.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, there's something about knowing someone quite well, but not super well, that it's a sort of weird and difficult thing to process, because like this boy at school, it was like I wasn't friends with him, but I'd seen him at the pub and he'd bought me a drink before, and he was a nice kid, and I'd chatted to him in the hallway, but I wasn't close to him. And I felt this profound grief about his death. And then I almost felt guilty about it, because I felt like I wasn't one of the people who had a right to feel that way.
Yeah. I think I think even from my perspective, it's the same, but like on a different level, like with his family as well, right? Like you have a different type of relationship, then you feel there is that sense of like, you feel guilty for feeling so sad, because then I start thinking about how much worse would be for them. And you don't want to take away from the fact that it's a weird thing that I think your brain starts doing, right? And sometimes it's the grief of what, like for me, some of it is the grief of what wasn't, right? Like there was so much more to achieve, not only as a friend, but also as what we were working on, right? Like it's the grief of like, we had plans. There were plans that we were like.
He was going to come on this podcast.
He was going to come on this podcast. He was going to, there was, yes, there's so many different facets, I think, to how kind of that initial shock and grief hits you. And it doesn't matter how long you've known someone. It's about that connection you've had with them.
You go to that sort of loose end. I remember my mind sort of going to the loose end of, I had a little email exchange with him where he was like, we should go for a coffee. And I said, yeah, let's book it in. And we hadn't booked it in yet. And it was a really minor example of just like this loose end that's like, we're never going to go for that coffee now. Like that's just, and he was the sort of person I thought, I'll know you for a long time, but I don't know you well yet. I could sort of see how you're close to Kieron. I'm close to Kieron. We only work together for that short time, but we're sort of in each other's vague orbit, and, but then it just gets cut off. Yeah. And that's it. Yeah. It's such a difficult and weird thing to kind of mentally process.
Yeah, to apprehend it is, I think I'm still doing that now.
Obviously, Alex was this is such an interesting and difficult intertwining of the fact that he was a friend, he was a mentor, and he was also a colleague, and a current colleague at the time that this happened. How did you sort of navigate this in the first instance, considering it spanned like both of your worlds in quite a profound way?
So I think the immediate thing was that I knew immediately that I needed to leave that space, and I couldn't go back and I didn't know whether I was going to go back. And I knew that immediately. The first 5 months of me being in that company, Alex was there. Alex was very much a part of everything and every day. And he was my person I reported into directly. But I think the first thing that maybe this was just like a protection mechanism was that I essentially left the business in my head, and kind of maybe I just like deferred making decisions into a later date, which sounds very professional, but I just in my head was like, the first thing I need to do to protect myself is to remove myself from the business. And they were fantastic. They were like, take as much time as you need. And in my head, I didn't know, and people that were in similar situations didn't know whether they could go back. So I didn't put that pressure on myself. So I think the first thing that kind of I did was take myself out of everything and hand over what I could, which I didn't have much of a capacity to do. But I just removed myself from anything that had to do with work, because everything in work would remind me of Alex. So for me, it was just massively and highly triggering at that time. So the first thing I did, I think, was just not try and think about going back to work and trying to just deal with the news that I'd found out and figure everything else out later. And I'm quite good at compartmentalizing things, which I think I knew about myself, but I think this really put it to the test. I just was not interested in having any conversations about work, going back to work, what was happening at work. It was the first time ever, which I think I felt at the time, it was quite confusing for me, because I'd never ever stepped away from work so much that I left my team without someone leading them. And I think that was the hardest thing for me, was just that abrupt me leaving and them having to just continue with no real
handover or guidance. And there were other people that are at my level were out. We were essentially all out apart from one person. That was really hard for me. I never leave my teams like that. I always either give them the tools to be able to, continue for a certain amount of time without me. And I felt like I was 5 months in. We were in the middle of some really complex bits of work and management of some of the relationships with some of the people that we were working with, all that kind of stuff. And it was the first time where I was like, it was, even though it felt like I was being pulled mentally in two different directions, it was actually the first time where I was like, Kieron, you are no use right now. Yeah.
So actually you staying would be worse than you just stepping away from the business. And I remember speaking to one of my colleagues, and she decided to keep working. And I think the first week she was fine, and it just hit her. I also knew that I needed to be in a good place to decide whether I was going to come back, number one. And two, once I did come back, to be able to support people, that it hits people differently at different times. And I knew it would start hitting people a little bit later. And I wanted to make sure that I had some kind of resilience to support them as well if I did decide to return. Yeah. So it was, the first thing was, I think, stepping away.
Well, on that note, one of the things that feels like a kind of feature of grief is a sort of anger that the world keeps turning.
Yeah.
Things keep happening. You still have to pay your electricity bill, and people are still asking you work questions, and your workplace, which had lost very central human being to the workplace, still has deadlines and, product launch dates. And there's a sort of, we can kind of take a moment, but ultimately we need to find a new, chief product officer. How jarring does it feel that stuff, those questions remain, as this person as a whole human being has been lost?
I actually think that it was dealt with quite well in the company that I work for. I think they were very sensitive. Nothing was rushed. The expectations of our delivery was it was spoken about openly, and I think that was partly us going. And once I was ready to go back to work, I think I took about just under 4 weeks off. There was no pressure for me to come back. There was also people were checking in on me, and it wasn't about work. So work people were checking in on me, and it wasn't about work. And then once I was back, it was, for me, the way that I processed it might be not the same way. I know it wasn't the same way that everybody else processed it, but I know that I felt like I was very lucky, because I'd spent so much time with Alex in the past. I could kind of, he's never going to leave your psyche. So I could kind of have conversations about what he would do in that situation, just from understanding the way that he thought and what I did know about the way that he thought. And I know that one of the things that and I believe this to this day, would be like, come on, we've started this, let's continue. You have to continue. I know that he wouldn't want everything to go completely off the rails because he'd passed away. I know that he'd be like, right, you still got so much to give. This team are an amazing team. Let's continue what we started here. And that for me was really reassuring. And that was something that I had, whether it was subconscious or consciously, having those conversations with my memory of Alex was very, very helpful. I think from that then allowed me to, in that moment, I think when I think back retrospectively, it was partly survival mechanism, but it allowed me to have those really hard conversations about moving forward, which was very, very hard. But for me, it was always linked to the fact that I know Alex wouldn't have wanted everything to grind to a halt. And he was just such an optimistic person. He had so much energy. I don't think I'd ever seen him just stop. When I know that he was really struggling in the past in other roles, he never stopped. It was never an option to just like sit back. So I think that helped me then have those conversations that needed to be had, and being part of the leadership within the product and engineering team that I was in, I also knew how important it was for us to start picking the pieces up to make sure that our team were okay, and they felt like they had some stability, and we were able to kind of stabilize the team. So I think there was lots of things that were powering me through the fact that it was so intertwined. It was weird at first. When I first walked in, it was very, very strange. I remember walking in and just being like, you just in your head, you're like, I don't really usually care about these kind of things, but I'm like, I know everyone's looking at me and thinking like, just that's so sad, or like, oh, that's such a horrible situation to be in. Or I was like, maybe everyone in the team was a reminder that Alex has passed away every time you came into a room, like it's very strange how your mind starts thinking about how you're being perceived. But I lent into the fact that the business were being very sensitive with the way that they dealt with it, and those open conversations that something like this affords. So, I was able to have and build kind of relationships with people because they were forced to, in terms of speaking openly about how you're feeling and what you think the team needs and all those kind of things. So not only with the people team, but some of the C-suite. And they return that, right?
It's a sudden intimate human intimacy that you probably haven't had with those people until that point.
Your humanity takes over.
Yeah. And it's interesting what you said about continuing the work.
Yeah.
Almost continuing the work wouldn't be disrespectful. In a way, it's the opposite. It's the most respectful thing you could have done to continue, rather than it feeling like, how could you possibly without him being there.
Yeah, and I wanted to make sure also so I think someone came in kind of in his role in the first about a month and a half or 2 months after. I think about 2 months after, and the way that person came in was, I have to say, dealt with in quite a sensitive way. But I don't think anyone can get that perfect. It's a really, really difficult situation to come into in a leadership role and have to having not been there when it happened, but also kind of in the shoes of someone that is so incredible and built all of these relationships.
Ironically, the kind of person who would have done that well was Alex.
Yes, very true. Very, very true.
It's that kind of character who would have done that elegantly.
Exactly.
And with the kind of humility that is needed. I don't know how much you know about the specifics of this in Alex's case, but I'm interested in what you think about what should be done in terms of, because it sounds like your workplace handled it well as could be expected psychologically, emotionally, in terms of the people team support for colleagues. There are some workplaces, I mean, Google's one like historic example, that offer benefits to spouses that are quite significant in if an employee dies. Do you have a view on what workplaces should have in place for situations like this, specifically for the family, I suppose?
Yeah, I think a lot of workplaces, and from my experience, have some kind of life insurance in place, which is attached to your employment. For me, I think, and if they don't, they should. Everywhere should have it. And it should be a significant amount that at least kind of supports the people impacted, the person's family, through any of the financial stuff that they need to then deal with after, which I think anyone who really realizes how much stuff needs to be done by the spouse. It's incredible from the conversations I've had with his wife. It's almost like, and how much emotional toll that takes, having to do those things like closing people's accounts and all these kind of things. Like, it's just insane. You don't realize how, especially with the way that we are as humans now, and how our digital footprint and all those kind of things, everything we have a login for, everything we have an account for, everything we have payments going out, like, it's a massive task. And I think not only being able to give families a fighting chance of being able to survive financially after that person, especially if the person was the main breadwinner, which I don't know if that was the case with Alex, but I think it's really important for companies to be prepared for that. I think the other thing as well for me is, this might seem weird, but I think that there should be really clear guidelines of how you deal with somebody dying in the workplace. And I think it should almost be drilled. Like, I think that teams and leaders need to know how to respond to it, because it's like nothing you've ever dealt with before. And it will pose maybe, so what you would experience in 2 years around people's mental health, it will bring all of that to the surface. I think within a month, you will experience the same amount of issues across the team from that person's passing, especially someone like Alex, that you might not be prepared for. So I would say that there definitely needs to be work around, like, understanding, it obviously doesn't happen every single day in a company, but it will happen. And I think the response to that is really, really important to someone's ability to grieve and for them to stay on top of their mental health. So I think there's a financial side of it, but then there's also the support for those families and the people in the workplace.
Almost like logistical support for the family as well as emotional and financial.
What I said at the beginning about my relationship with Alex, I think it makes me, one of the things that was quite traumatic for me was finding out in front of everybody, including people that reported into me. Although I had great relationships with everyone, I'd been there for 5 months. You're on screen, you're in front of people. I think in hindsight, what maybe would have been a better way to have done that is to, before announcing that, I know there is a timeline, but before announcing it, really understanding some of those relationships, like are there anybody in Alex's direct reporting lines that he's worked with before? Let's get them told first.
Yes.
And I think that would have been a better way of, I wouldn't have come into work, right?
No, and you wouldn't have been on that meeting. Yeah.
I probably wouldn't have been on the meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was quite traumatic for me, but I completely understand that, in that moment, nobody is necessarily prepared or has a rule book of how you do these things, but it's definitely something that I would say moving forward, I'll try and think about in the future, for teams that I lead and companies that I work at.
Yeah. What's been the biggest help for you in the process of mourning Alex?
So for me, it's been, we talked earlier about wanting to speak to people that knew him. I think I felt compelled to reach out to people that I'd had great relationships with Alex. So someone that I worked at a previous company, I didn't know whether he knew, but I reached out to him and he told me that he knew. And that we then spoke on the phone for like 2 or 3 hours, and we checked on each other every week. I was meant to meet him last week actually, but we're still catching up. But I think those initial conversations were really important to me. And it was a massive help, because you were going through, and he knew Alex for even longer and was a really close friend with Alex. Not only helped give a space where you could have that kind of emotional vulnerability with somebody that is having the same types of feelings around what's happened and the same shock. It was just also a really positive the fact that we then reconnected off the back of that was great. I also have a coach, Robert Hutchinson, who has been incredible. He was one of the first people. So I found out on a Thursday, I spoke to my mum in the evening, and I told her I had coaching, so executive coaching the next day. And she said, I think you should still go. And I've been working with Robert, I think, for a couple of years. And that conversation and that space that he created was incredible. And then I think a little bit later on, so I've been doing bereavement therapy for the last, I think, 3 months. And that's been really helpful for me after kind of the immediate shock. It's been helpful for me to start to try and process what's happened and how it's impacting my feelings and my relationships, not only within work, and just being on top of that and understanding how this is how the grief might be manifesting in different ways than I'd been able to identify by myself. So I think those have been really good. And also just my friends, you, the podcast. I think all of those things have been really important. I know that in October, which actually would have just been released, so people would be able to listen to them, but we recorded a bunch of episodes, which I think was really helpful. Not only did it distract me, but it helped me. It really did help me. So I'd say, yeah. And obviously family, like for me, that's a given. They're always going to be there in terms of they're always going to be so supportive. It's just kind of the normal way that my family operate.
You've sort of touched on this a little bit in what you just said, but we're a year on, and for me at least, it feels like weeks ago that we got this news. I can't imagine how it feels for Alex's wife and his kids.
Yeah.
In terms of that sort of elasticity of time. Where are you at now? What does 1 year on look and feel like?
I am in a place where I can have a conversation about Alex. I might get a bit teary, but before, I don't think I would have been able to. Well, I wasn't able to speak about Alex for a long time at all, not without like breaking down, because it was, it just reminded me of how much things had changed in such a short period of time. I think now, after doing a lot of work, I guess I'm just a little bit on top of how and why I feel the way that I feel, how it's impacted me, but also how it's impacted other people, but also just there was a part of me that was just so upset that he'd been taken away from so many people when he was such a good person.
The unfairness of it.
It feels so unfair. But even though I'm getting emotional now, I know that you can't put all your energy in that anger. I think you have to take away the positives. So I think a year on, it still feels like it was a couple of weeks ago, but it also feels like it was 5 years ago. It's a really weird feeling because when you're dealing with something like that, when the way that your brain processes it, it tries to distance you from it, and it will create this perception of time gets warped. I remember we were talking just before a podcast that we were recording, and I was like, I remember being, I think I was like, oh yeah, I must have said, it's coming up to 6 months, and I think you were like, Kieron, it's been 3.
Yeah.
Like I remember we were having a conversation, and I was like, or I said it was in September, and you're like, I think he passed away in August. Like your brain does stuff, I guess, to protect you, and it just distances it from you, but then it's also just very close as well all the time. So you kind of feel a bit disorientated, I guess. I feel like I feel like I don't think that will ever go away, and I still feel that way. But I do feel like it feels like the right thing to do to remember him. And doing this podcast, for example, is a really important part. I think for me, and I hope for other people that knew him, that he's still being spoken about, because I think he was an incredible person. And we're doing some things at work as well to remember him. So I'm in a place, but I don't know what it is.
We're somewhere.
We're somewhere. And people, when people ask me about it, like I said, I can speak about Alex now.
I think you've kind of answered this, so you don't necessarily need to answer it, but we've talked about keeping it alive at least. What would you say, at least to you, Alex's legacy is, and how can we keep it alive?
Alex's legacy is his openness to people, his inquisitiveness and understanding and empathy and EQ. It's his willingness to be different, but also to build relationships. It's so many things. It's his want for people to meet their potential and to support that. His ability to deliver. Like, I think that's one of the things that, no one can question the fact that he was operating at a different level as a lot of people. But I think from a personal level, it was just his ability to make people feel at ease and to really care. And he had a big heart. And although he was a very private person, he let people in as much as I think either he needed or he felt they needed. So I think it worked both ways for him. But I think kind of fuels, I'm fueled by his legacy. I want to pass on that energy to other people. I want to continue that. I want to, I could never be him. I'm a different person. I think there were lots of things that we were aligned on and that we approach things in similar ways. But I want to make sure that energy that was given to me is never wasted. So for me personally, it's also, he's now that voice, one of the voices in my one of the voices in my head's brilliant. He's one of the voices in my head who's always guiding me. He's always, I can recall on so many conversations that we had, and I just feel so lucky to be able to have that and have him as a part of me. I think that's the thing that I think a lot of people need to remember is when people pass away, no one can take away the fact that they're a part of you. You've had those experiences with them and they will always be a part of you. They will always be there to guide you. And I'm not a religious person, but that's just for the way the memory works, right? And I think it's really important to lean into that. And that's exactly what I'm doing because that's helping me. And I think for me, that's part of his legacy. All the pieces of himself that he left for other people as tools and as support and all those things.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Impolite Company.
If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to our show and share it far and wide with anyone you think will benefit.
And if you'd like to connect with us directly, we're on LinkedIn as Kieron Scott Woodhouse and Ella McCann Tomlin.
We'll be back soon.